Well, welcome, Dr. Timothy Weingard, to Ride and Tie Tongue Tied Interviews.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I am so glad. I found you last year when my public library's audiobook section had the mosquito, and I listened to the mosquito, and I was absolutely transfixed. And I had just this thing that for me is just kind of a pest to discover. Well, it's the humanity's greatest predator, and I have to say I was a little alarmed when I toward the end when you're saying it may be making a comeback for us in the West. I guess it's always been a problem elsewhere. But so then I said, well, what else has this guy done? And lo and behold, you have just released your book, The Horse, which is a much nearer and dear to my heart than mosquitoes are. And so I asked for it for Christmas and got it and absolutely loved it. And so thank you so much for agreeing to let me talk to you a little bit today.
Yeah, of course.
It, my biggest takeaway, I would say, from the book is that, and it's actually true of the mosquito too, these animals that we tend to see as peripheral maybe actually are incredibly prominent. Human history would be so totally different without them. And I think we see horses just as something you ride, and you really show how they have been engines of exploration and transportation, of course, and war and just human history is so different. So let me begin by just asking, how did you make the transition from the mosquito to the horse? How did you decide to switch out that way?
Well, when I finished the mosquito, or when I came out, I always kind of brainstorm topics for new books. The mosquito was my fifth book, and the horse that just came out is my sixth book. And there's a series of events that happened relating to horses that kind of pushed me in that direction. But long story short, during the COVID lockdown, my neighbors have horses, and I was driving to the university, and I saw them on horseback past some kids who were walking. And then, of course, I blew past the horses in my car, and I started thinking about our primary modes of transportation as humans, from millions of years of bipedalism to what turns out to be about 5,500 years of horsepower before the internal combustion engine unseats the horse, really only 80 to 100 years ago. And so that was the first kind of series of events. And then I was walking my dog, and he started sniffing the horse manure on the road from my neighbors. And I thought about, looking around at all the cars parked in driveways. 150 years ago, this would have all been stables and horses for all of our needs as a society, and the amount of manure and urine that would have covered urban centers. So that was kind of rolling around in my brain. And then obviously I'm Canadian, so I'm a big hockey fan. And I was missing my NHL games. And so I was flipping through the TV trying to avoid all the news and all the coverage of COVID. And I came across ski joring, which is a person on skis being pulled by a horse. And it was, of course, live from Leadville, Colorado, because it was outside. So that was kind of the finishing touch of it. I had already started some research, and I'm like, my wife looked at me and said, "You got to write your horse book." And I was like, yeah, I think Yoda's giving me a sign. So that was kind of a series of events that I guess pushed me further into an idea that I already had
Yeah,
of looking at. We often think we get to make our own history, and that we're the supreme players in formulating our history, and that's not necessarily true. There's external factors that play equal, if not sometimes larger roles, and certainly the mosquito with vectoring these diseases, and then the horse as our pinnacle ally throughout the last 5,000 years of our historical trails. So it's along that same vein of looking at external factors that had such an impact on how and where we got to today.
I love the phrase just used, pinnacle ally. Horses for humans initially were we were their predators, and then at some point a partnership developed. Tell me a little about what your research shows about all of that. How did we go from just preying on them to actually them being our pinnacle partners?
So, like any other animal, obviously our human and hominid ancestors hunted horses and a wide variety of other animals, what was ever available. I'm sure they were hunters of opportunity. and took what they could get, or scavenged as well what they could get from carrion. But largely, so the horse, the epicenter of evolution for the horse is actually in North America. It's in the area where I am currently in Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico area, Utah, from a 10-pound creature called a Hyracotherium, which is kind of about the size of a fox that looks kind of more like a deer and bounded like a deer. And over 60 million years evolves into the Equus family that we have today. But largely by 4000 BCE, the horse had gone extinct across the entire planet, save for a small pocket of the Eurasian grasslands called the Pontic Caspian Steppe, north of the Black and Caspian Seas. And this is where Indo-Europeans eventually domesticate the horse 3500 BCE or 5500 years ago. And originally, like every other barnyard animal, it's domesticated for a literal livestock of milk, meat, hide, sinew, everything, and they used it all. And then very quickly they realized the utilitarian potential of this animal for war, trade, travel, transport, you name it. So the horse very quickly becomes this, I like to refer to it as a living machine. As much as it's an organic animal, it really becomes humanity's greatest invention in the fact that it is a living machine. And very quickly upon domestication, humans are selectively breeding horses for a more docile temperament and a flatter back to ease riding and the pressure on the horse's spine to flatten the back. So, and then we add, of course, upgrades to the horse, whether that's stirrups, saddles, horse collars, bits, you name it. So again, we add, just like we upgrade our cars or upgrade apps on our phone or whatever else it is, we upgrade the horse so it becomes this pinnacle of biotechnology almost.
Remind me if I'm correct. You talked about breeding for them being more docile. Is it every horse descends that the modern horse descends from one stallion that was maybe a little more docile, or just a lot of them?
Well, we're not sure, but stallions are obviously more aggressive than mares or females are, by nature of evolution and survival. But so what we think looking at the DNA of horses is there's a larger female lineage in horse DNA. So there would have been fewer stallions. They might have had breeding stallions and then initially captured wild mares to add them to the fold because mares are just by nature more docile and easier to corral and tame. So would they have been descended from all stallions? No. All modern thoroughbreds are descended from three stallions. So that line of horses, arguably the most inbred animal on the planet, given its descent from three Arabian stallions in the late 1600s and early 1700s from England. But there is a very narrow Y chromosome originally with domestication.
Okay, thank you. Riding tie is, as you may know, is an endurance sport, and it's not completely, but large. But there's a lot of Arabians in there, so we are fully aware of it. And of course, that's where thoroughbreds came from as well. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, we get that. So I like in pretty early in the book, you just speculate, but somehow we move from using them as livestock to using them as transportation. And who do you think the first person that got the idea to jump on a horse was?
Well, I get some flack for this because I call it a young male, and obviously that's not me being a misogynist or me. The fact that sometimes in history females didn't get to play an equal role, while unfortunate, and we can lament that, it doesn't change that fact either. And that's not me being anything but a historian. And I wish it were different because we get to use 52% more of our brain power throughout history, which is pretty silly not to. But because males were the hunters, it would have likely have been a young male because they were familiar with the behavior of an animal in order to try to get close to it or grab it and then eventually tame that individual animal. So again, it could have been a female, but likely based on how Indo-European culture worked, it was very paternalistic and patriarchal. So likely you're not going to approach an animal if you have no idea of its behavior or its capabilities. And so because males were the hunters, it's most likely a young male who, and this is an apocryphal story. Of course, we don't know exactly how it happened, but I'd like to think it was a young male who was dared by his hunting buddies to
Yeah.
go tame or jump on the back of a wounded or docile mare, and then parade this thing back to his village to the shock and awe of his family and his clan members. But of course, we don't really know. But the process would have been corralling one horse at the beginning and then adding to that livestock and then building a founder population of what they call it from those initial tamed horses to eventually domesticate the entire breed. Taming an animal and domesticating a species are not the same thing. Hannibal tamed elephants, but we've never domesticated elephants.
Hmm.
Mike Tyson's tiger or Coco the gorilla are tamed, but we've never domesticated those species. So there's a blurred progression between taming individual animals and then domesticating an entire species, which when we look at the animal kingdom, we've actually domesticated very few animals because they don't have the pre-adaptive package of traits and behavior or simply don't want to be. It has to be a mutual partnership where both us and whatever animal that is take from our relationship. So very few animals, just no thanks. We're good. We're happy the way we are.
Yep. So what was in it for the horse? We know what was in it for the people. What was in it for the horse?
So horses have easy access to food. They have easy access to sexual reproduction, meaning they don't have to work for it. It's right there, and I mean that on the Maslow hierarchy of needs, actual reproduction of the species for survival. And then they get a herd mentality, which they have in the wild from their human host, just like your cat there gets it gets a social pack from humanity. Dogs are the same way. The Siberian gray wolf is the first domesticated animal on the planet, and what it gets from humans is companionship, free food, free grooming, and easy access to all that. So it's a win-win for both species. Now it has to. They also have to have those pre-adaptive traits where we can kind of use a barnyard version of Stockholm syndrome to originally tame those first few animals, and then that leads to domestication.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned a while ago you didn't want to be a misogynist. One of the things that was fascinating to me about the book was and you're such a great historian because you don't. This is not a romance for the horse or propaganda for the horse. You give the good, the bad, and the ugly, both for horses and people. There is this sort of mythology, a pleasant mythology about indigenous folk in the Americas, and when horses were introduced to them, how that benefited them. But you see it a little differently and tell a different story, and particularly the part about it not being egalitarian really hits. So will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we have. I mean, that's one of my areas of study or concentration is global indigenous peoples and military history as well. But we have this often romanticized view of, with headdress and horse, the plains indigenous peoples and how the horse transformed their cultures for the better. And that really within the Columbian Exchange, they get nothing good except the horse. I mean, they get disease, death, and obviously lose their land and their population declines. And the only good thing they got was the horse. And I argue that's not true at all, that they didn't get anything good from the Columbian Exchange, including the horse. They do adopt a horse culture very quickly, specifically the Comanche in the southern plains and the Lakota in the northern plains. And it transforms their culture literally overnight, as well as the Navajo, the Apache, the Ute, the Shoshone, some other groups as well in native indigenous nations. But largely what it does is it corrupts their societies from top to bottom through the introduction of capitalism via the bison fur trade. And that removes egalitarian principles from their societies. It creates hierarchies of power, hierarchies of wealth. It undermines gender roles. Long story short, is they able to harvest bison at an industrial level, which means they have an accumulation of wealth, something they didn't do before the horse. Because prior to the horse, really hunting bison on foot would have been incredibly dangerous, or funneling them into kill zones in cliff faces or dead ends of slot canyons, or running them off cliffs like Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta. So they would only harvest what they needed because there was no capitalist economy in indigenous culture. There was no surplus or purposeful surplus for capitalism. When the horse is introduced, they can harvest bison at an industrial level and enter the Euro American and Euro Canadian fur trade via the bison hide and other fur trade. And that completely shatters their cultures to the point where it undermines their cultures and leads to their eventual subjugation in both Canada and the US on the Great Plains. So in fact, it's quite the opposite of what most people think of the horse being this uplifting element of the Columbian Exchange. It's not actually. It's just as prolific or as deadly as Jared Diamond's trifecta of guns, germs, and steel. And in the book, I literally use that example. I say it's guns, germs, steel, and horses.
Yeah, yeah. That's
And
just
again, it's not the horse's fault. And
right.
the horse is conscripted into our, our events, our wars, and our undertakings, whether the outcome or the intention is noble or nefarious. They don't get a choice.
Yeah, we need to get a horse to write a book called The Human, don't we?
Yes. And they'd say, why are all these humans going broke, betting all their money on us running around a track? Horses don't do that. I wonder which species is smarter.
Yeah. Well, and that I'm so glad you went there, because that was where I want to go next. So tell me a little about horses and sport.
So obviously, when upon the first domestication, there would have been informal horse racing immediately with Indo-Europeans and other early horse cultures, just because that's entertainment. I mean, we often lose sight of that entertainment has been around since the dawn of humanity. Even that sitting around a fire, we all get mesmerized by a fire telling stories around a campfire, strumming a guitar. Or, I mean, they had instruments too. They had drums and they had their hands. And so there would have been horse racing instantaneously upon domestication in some form, because we think riding was very shortly followed domestication. So obviously horse racing would have been the first sport, and then it's formalized when we see these great empires like the Assyrians or the Persians or Alexander, or then the Greeks with their hippodrome, and obviously Nero's circus in Rome with horse racing. It's part of the original Olympics in the 1770s BCE, chariotry racing, and actually Alexander's dad, King Philip, wins some of these early Olympic horse racing, his entries. So then polo is invented by the Persians in 500 BCE. So Cyrus Darius the Great, as a way for both horse and rider to maintain war readiness during times of peace, which makes complete sense. So we have horses being athletes in sports very early on, and that continues to this day, whether it's your sport or equestrian sports in the Olympics, where obviously the only non-human athlete are these amazing horses that compete in the various equestrian events. So it just, because the horse has been so omnipresent in our lives as humans and within our shared collective consciousness as humans, we often just overlook it, and we see horses because they're always there in movies and in our history, but we don't actually see horses. We look kind of through them or past them because they're just as omnipresent as humans. So we just, that, and so we often blithely overlook their importance in human societies and in shaping our history and in our cultures, because they've just always been there. And I guess that's what the book is about. Is some of it seems like no brainers in the book, but then you're like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. That makes complete sense. The fact that no one wore pants until we started riding horses. Why would you wear pants? They're not comfortable. We got sarongs and togas and kilts and wraps. Those are much more comfortable. But you get on a horse as a male or female in one of those, you're going to realize pretty quickly we need new garments. And so pants, the invention of pants correlate directly with early horseback riding. And that's one of those like, oh, well, that makes complete sense. Well, sure, but nobody thinks or talks about that.
You might be interested to know that the sport of riding tie was actually invented by an executive at the Levi Strauss Company. They were looking for a sport that would kind of encapsulate their sport. And early on, when they no longer sponsor, but early on when they were sponsoring races, they would double the purse if you won the race and you were wearing Levi's. Which is not
Nice.
the best pair of pants to be wearing if you're running a lot, because that's part of it too. But
Yeah, no,
obviously,
that's some chafe there. But if
yeah,
you
yeah.
look at the Levi's, the symbol on the Levi's tag, it's horses pulling a pair of
Yeah.
pants,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yep.
there's ironically, I don't think Levi's knew this when they invented their brand symbol, but obviously there is a connection between the origin of pants and horses.
Yeah.
So that's kind of ironic in a way that they have horse showing the strength of the pants, horses trying
Right.
to tear the pants. That's their original on that leather tag. That's
Right.
the drawing. So it's kind of ironic that they actually include horses without knowing that pants were invented by
Right.
horses.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No Levi's without horses for sure. Yeah. Well, one of the things that you alluded to a little bit, the Olympics and horses, and not only are horses the only animal in the Olympics, but that's the only sport that men and women compete head to head against. That is also true in the endurance sport, both endurance riding, where you stay in the saddle the whole time, and then in ride and tie, where you have two people and one horse are the team. I just love it that we are egalitarian that way, and that I think partly the distance and then partly the horse kind of the equalizing factors. And our in riding tie, the woman who is really I call the greatest of all time. She's got well over 1,500, probably closer to 2,000 more competitive miles than anybody else, and has won everything you can win. She's a woman, and her main partners are women, and they just mop up, and that's kind of a neat thing. Do you know of, and I don't know off the top of your head, you can do this, another sport that has two people and one animal, maybe particularly two people and one horse? I can't think of any. Obviously, things like polo, you've got a team of horses and people, or
I want,
racing people.
yeah, I don't know. I'm not as, I mean, we have a rodeo team at Colorado Mesa University where I teach. Um, and I'm not familiar. I mean, I go watch the rodeo, and I'm good friends with the coach, and he lets me ride his horses. And the old ones, though, I'm like, he lets me ride his 30-year-old horse with one eye because it's like, like that's the one I want.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, which is pushing the limits of lifetime for this old horse. He's probably like, get the hell off me, man. Um, I wonder if there's a rodeo event of some kind that would have more than one um, human in the event. And I'm trying to think of watching rodeo.
Roping, but that's usually two horses and two people. But I did think of
Yeah,
one as you're talking. You mentioned earlier, ski joring is one. You got a guy riding the horse and a guy on the ski. So that's
yeah,
one.
ski joring would be
Yeah,
because yet you got the two people and
yeah,
the one horse.
yeah.
Yeah, I think really quickly that comes to mind is that's the only one that I can think of would be ski joring. Um, But
Well,
the interesting thing to your point about the horse, and I mentioned this in the book, is it's a very democratic resource because anybody can own a horse,
mm-hmm.
male, female, poor, rich, and so it kind of levels the playing field um, for all humans because originally you could go get a wild horse and tame it, you can steal horses, you can buy a horse, so it becomes this very egalitarian or I guess democratic resource originally, and we do see this with the Amazons, which are or the technical term of their group is the Massagattai, but these are known as the Amazons in history. They're female-led Indo-European group. They're very matriarchal. They're led by a queen. And in fact, one of their queens, Tamara, she's the one who kills Cyrus the Great, the emperor of the Persian Empire, chops his head off and turns the top of his skull into her gilded drinking cup, which is part of their culture. So we see women in China reach very high ranks within the military and cavalry, like top generals that are female. So it really is an egalitarian resource, and that's because it combines the brains of humans with the brawn of an animal,
Mm-hmm.
with the strength, speed, size, and stamina of the horse with the brains of our species. So when you combine these two species in this Centurion pact, it really and figuratively lifts the capabilities of human beings to circumvent our own biological deficiencies in size, speed, strength, and stamina. So it's this combination of this magnificent, powerful animal and our magnificent and powerful brain, for better or for worse. So it takes out any whether the size or it's about intelligence for the rider. So gender is irrelevant in that
Yeah.
in those factors. So
And then a huge part of that factor is the bond between the human and the horse. And I know you can just jump on a horse and go, but even then, they can sense. I don't know how they do it. If I'm on their back and I'm anxious, they know it. And if I'm relaxed, they know it and they react accordingly. And it doesn't have to be a horse that I know, but the bond can be so strong. I want if you talk about that a little bit, and maybe particularly, I just never get tired of hearing the story. I'd like you to tell the story of Alexander and Bucephalus, but also if there are other human horse bond stories you have, and why you think that happened in ways that it certainly didn't happen with cows or goats or anything like that.
I think it's twofold. Is one, it speaks to the just heavy influence of domestication. So when my wife and I do a 3 mile walk every day, either in the morning or at night, and as I said, there's horses all around us in our neighborhood. It's we're in the city, but it's still kind of rural, which is nice. And so we walk past these horses, and the fence is just it's one tiny rope. It's
Mm-hmm.
got these tiny pegs, this single rope, and the horses will not go past, and it's not electrified either. And I think this 1,300-pound animal is just sitting there staring at me as I walk right by it, and it's not scared of me. It came to the fence to like see us. And I mentioned this the other day when we were walking. I said, think about how many generations of domestication it takes to get that massive animal that's designed 100% for flight to not be scared of us and to actually want to come to, and to be corralled by this single thin yellow rope and go, oh, I better not go past that onto the road. It's an amazing thing, actually, when you think about it like that. And I stood there for a minute, looking at and then petting this horse on our walk, and was thinking about that such intense domestication, first of all, and training. And then two, it is a testament to how close our relationship has been for the past 5,000 years, that we have this innate bond. And again, that speaks to our shared history. You can't have one without the other. We are not human without horses, and horses are not horses without humans, because of how our bond is so tightly knit and how important they were to us as we progressed over the last 5,000 years of culture and civilization all over the world. And that's the other thing, is this is globally universal. It's not limited to just Europe or just early empires. This is a bond and a pact between two animals that it spreads across space and time for the last 5,000 years. And I think that's why that is. We don't have a relationship like this with any other animal, save perhaps the dog. But again, if you remove the dog from humanity and our history would still look the same. Might be a little lonelier, but the dog didn't change our history. Horses fundamentally made humans what we are, and made our history and our modern world order what it is. No other animal can say that, other than the mosquito. No other animal can say that. Cats are cats, goat, sheep. So I think that is the driving factors, those two, to your question, which is in itself what the book is about.
Yeah. So Alexander the Great bonds with Bucephalus early, and then they go and conquer the world. Give me the thumbnail story of that in case people don't know it. It's so
So,
wonderful.
long story short, Alexander was around, I guess, around 10, 12 years old, and his dad was King Philip, was going to buy this massive Thessalian black stallion, who started going crazy around Pella, wrecking the market. Like nobody could corral it. The person who was going to sell it's like, I'm not dealing with this horse. It was a huge horse, and basically going crazy and wrecking the downtown of the capital city of Macedonia. And Alexander pleaded, Dad, I want the horse. And the one eyed king is, I have no use for this unruly horse. And Alexander scolded both his dad and all the advisors and said, You're going to let this horse go away because all of you are too incompetent to tame it. At which Philip was not amused with. So Alexander removed his cloak and his outer garments, and used the teachings of Xenophon, the great Greek horse master, and whispered to the horse, and came from the opposite side of the horse because he had figured out that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. So he turned the horse uh, from its shadow. The horse calmed down. He, stroked it. It was kind of like a horse whisperer, and then jumped on the horse and rode around the downtown of Pella, basically telling everybody like, "You all suck, and I'm the greatest." And everyone was amazed. He named it Bucephalus, which means ox head, and he rode that horse into battle throughout his entire life. And Bucephalus, as far as we know, was, and Alexander, as you know, led from the front. He wasn't in the rear with the gear. He led the companion cavalry, which was the elite cavalry in every battle, and he was the first to charge. So over the course of 20 major battles and other minor scuffles, he rode Bucephalus, and Alexander sustained some brutal injuries, 8 major injuries as far as we know, but Bucephalus none. And obviously, people began to believe, including Alexander himself, that he was a god and that Bucephalus was also a god. And so Bucephalus dies on Alexander's eastern limit line in what is now India, Pakistan. And there's two competing theories, that he dies of old age around the age of 30, or he dies of wounds sustained in the last battle against King Porus and his Indian army. But either way, he dies extremely old. He buries him in India and builds a city on top of him, and calls it Alexandria Bucephalus after his horse. So it's arguably the most famous human horse dyad in history is those two. But another story, two stories I really like that are in the book is during the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington was on his famous horse Copenhagen for 17 hours straight. And after the battle, obviously, when Napoleon's defeated and the British coalition wins, the Duke of Wellington gets off his horse and goes to, thank Copenhagen and pet him and say, "Thanks, buddy." And Copenhagen bites him when he gets off his, like, nice. And the other one, which is sad, but uplifting in a way, is after the Battle of Waterloo, Sir Cooper Astley, who is the physician to the king, adopts some maimed and wounded horses from the British cavalry and tries to, like, essentially bring them back to life. So he brings these horses to his estate and works tirelessly with his staff to remove grape shot and shrapnel and treat their burns. And so he rejuvenates and resuscitates essentially these half-dead horses back to life, these cavalry horses. And of course, he's super rich, so he has a huge estate in Herefordshire. And one morning, he goes out to his window to look at the horses, and they all get together. They line up perfectly in military formation. They launch into a cavalry charge, and then they stop and do perfect military drill, and then separate and go back to playing and grazing on their own. And they did this every morning. And I mean, it's such a sad story from you think of the PTSD that these horses had, but also an uplifting story that they got to spend the rest of their life on, away from war and in peace and on the rolling English plains. And he said that it would bring a tear to his eye every morning to watch these old war horses do their perfect military drill and charges, and then go frolic and play on his estate. So that's also a fantastic story.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you for those. I will say those who do endurance riding, and also there are some 100-mile riding ties. I'm 50 is the most I've done. But you have 24 hours to complete either a 100-mile endurance or a 100-mile riding ties. So 17 hours in the saddle, isn't that incredible to those of us in our sport? But it is a long time, and it is amazing if the horse is well trained and conditioned. They've still got a lot of gas left in the tank at the end. The rider actually is usually in worse shape than the horse at the end. It's amazing.
Well, in fairness to he wouldn't have been actually fighting per se because he was in command, but he would have been riding back and forth, controlling, his troops on the battlefield. And so he would have been not charging per se, but he would have been riding the entire 17 hours along his battle lines, giving orders and moving artillery and whatnot. So yeah, I don't blame the horse for biting him.
Right. Exactly. Well, I want to ask one more question. I got to set it up, but then I got a couple of little fun questions, and then we'll be done. in our sport, uh, of course, you're riding and you're running, and the horses so quickly, almost like the horses you mentioned, that every morning went out and did their training without being asked. They figure out this sport so fast. And we tie them typically to trees, and sometimes you're bebopping along through the woods, and the horse just stops and puts his head next to the tree. And tie me here, I'm ready. This is a good spot. Uh, and I want to tell you a story about one thing that happened to me and let you see if you can reflect on what you think is going on here. So, horses, obviously, and this is throughout the book, to understand horse psychology, you got to know they're herd animals and they're prey animals. And a lot of what they do is based out of those two factors. Yep. I'm out on my horse. This is a couple of years ago. My horse is a pretty high spirited Arabian. And he is the alpha horse on our farm. And so whenever he's around other horses, he wants to be the alpha horse also. And he hates being behind another horse. When we're on the trail, he is almost frantic to pass the other horse. And I tease and saying he's so fast and so powerful that he says to that other horse, you can walk, you can trot, you can canter, you can gallop. You decide how hard you want to work for me to come around you, but I'm coming around. And I'm usually riding the brakes on him more than I'm riding the gas. He also he just has this sense of, I mean, it feels like I know I'm in a race. But there's nothing from an evolutionary perspective that I can figure out why he would care that he comes in ahead of everybody else. And even when he passes another horse, he's not wanting to stay with the horse in the herd. He actually wants to he doesn't relax until that horse is out of earshot, out of we're by ourselves again, kind of. And so a couple of years ago, I'm on the ground. My partner is ahead of me riding on Coda is my horse. And we happened to be it was at the Big South Fork National Recreation Area, huge forest. And we're running down an old railroad grade that runs next to a river. So I can see probably a quarter mile or more down. And I see Coda standing in the middle of the trail. And I thought, wow, is he not tied? What's going on? I actually literally start looking to the sides to make sure my partner didn't get thrown and she's maybe, knocked out or something on the side of the trail. And then I said, no, it's just an optical illusion. He's tied. I just can't tell. I'm so far away. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't tied. And he was standing there fairly patiently waiting for me. And yet, as soon as I put my foot in the stirrup and he felt my weight coming across, before I even really got into the saddle, he was off like a shot because he was right back in the race. Any idea? He doesn't understand riding tie, but at some level he understood he need to wait for his partner. But what would explain that from an evolutionary perspective or a psychology perspective? Any idea?
Again, I'm a historian. I'm not a biologist, but based on how, again, as you mentioned, horses are 100% designed for flight. It's also why we're able to manipulate them and use their utilitarian power. Is they don't have sharp claws, they don't have horns or antlers, they don't have sharp teeth. I know males have canines, but they're not like a lion or a tiger, or they're really not sharp. So that's a benefit to us when we corral this animal to use it for our purposes. So when we look at other mammals, they're lacking in all these defensive weapons or offensive weapons, except for their speed. And I know they can kick, but so long story short is that if you're prey animal, which they are, you just have to outrun all the rest of the horses, and you're not going to get eaten. So that it's simple survival. Is eat but not eaten. So again, it's the slowest, or maybe you have a maimed horse or a wounded horse. Well, he's the last one. That's the one that's going to be eaten. During the throughout history. So that's part of it. I think the other part is when we look at how horses operate in there's no wild horses on the planet anymore. They're all feral domesticates. Like we have these Bookcliff wild horses up here in Grand Junction, Colorado. They're not actually wild. They're feral domesticates. Even the Przewalski's horses that have been released in China and Mongolia are domesticates who've been reintroduced to the wild. So is that in a horse herd, there's only one stallion. So if there's other males, your horse is either proving he's the alpha male or doesn't want to be around other stallions because in his mind they're a threat to his herd or his harem, as they call it. So there are some intrinsic biological traits that dictate some of that behavior. It's also how we can manipulate horses to tap into some of that behavior as well. So I think that's part of it. And then the other part is just years of classical conditioning through domestication, that we change the hardwiring of horses a little bit to respond to what we want them to do through training and through domestication, just the same as this horse down the street here who comes to the fence but won't go any further. I mean, the horse could easily just walk through that one rope. I mean, it's a tiny rope, but they don't because of, I mean, generations and generations over millennia of training and conditioning and selective breeding to manipulate some of those biological behaviors, tap into them, and then mold them to our liking. And then the other one is just the personal bond you have with your horse. Of, I mean, we see this with dogs who get lost and travel 2,000. They show up back at 2,000 miles. We see horses who get lost and come back to their homes. I think it's just this innate kind of relationship, which is again based on survival because you feed your horse, you groom your horse, you get so the horse wants to be back with you, but there's that relationship that I'm not going to do anything unless I'm told to do, and the person who tells me to do it, in that case, is you or your partner. So I think it's a lot of that mix.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would certainly like to think that some of it is just the relationship, the friendship that we've kind of developed. Not, but I know I don't want to anthropomorphize him too much, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think that's part of it too, but that friendship is based on a give and take of needs that both of you are getting from each other.
Yeah.
It's not to say that the horse, I mean, animals are only as intelligent as they need to be, right?
Yeah.
And so people say, are horses smart? I'm like, horses aren't smart or not smart. They're only as smart as evolutionary and survival pressures and survival of the fittest made them to be. They're smart for what they need to be. It's like saying, is a pig smart? Well, that's irrelevant. A pig is smart for what it needs to be. So judging intelligence is a bit of it's a tricky slope, because if you look at the size of a horse's brain or the part it uses, the cortex is about the size of a walnut, but that doesn't equate to intelligence. Intelligence is based on survival. So sure, a horse is very intelligent. They know when to run, the end. They know when to eat, not to eat, lift their head up. So this intelligence, that's not really a good measure of intelligence.
Right. Well, let me run through a few real quick little kind of fun questions. One is, you have at the end of your book a 24-page bibliography, which I think is just astounding. Given the interest in sport that I have and that we're doing this interview for, one or two books or authors that you would recommend that rather than going through 24 pages that I read next?
Oh. The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David Anthony was an amazing resource. It's a little bit dated because my book is probably dated now. The amount of research that is, especially with DNA, with new technology, we're trying to map the DNA of horses back to original domestication. So there is breakthroughs literally every week in study of equines, and it's a big field of study precisely because of how much the horse has impacted our society and our life. So the mountain of research was far more than any of my other books, and I knew that going in. The research took me about a year longer than any of my other books, and I did know that going in. But I also love it because I learned so much. So that book was fantastic. And I mean, some of the DNA stuff in there is a little bit out of date because it's, I don't know how 8 years old now, the book, or 10 years old, but it was a plethora of information for me. And it was just so well written, and I loved it. And I think I say this in the book too, about how brilliant it was. So that might be my top pick.
Okay, good. So what is next for you in your writing career? Do you know yet? Or are you just still recovering from this one.
Yeah, a little bit of both. Well, right now I'm right in the. I coach the. Obviously, I teach full time at Colorado Mesa University, but I'm also the hockey coach at the university. So we're in the throes of the season right now that goes from August to March. So right now I'm focusing on hockey for the most part and teaching and obviously my family too. I have some ideas that I've pitched to my editors at Penguin, and we'll see what they say.
Okay.
So that's all I'm going to give you is I pitched
Okay.
them three ideas, and we'll see which one they like. I just work here now.
So the mosquito was a New York Times bestseller, and I don't. Other than a politician gets his pack to buy a bunch of books, how do you become a bestseller, and how close is the horse to getting there?
Yeah, there was no asterisk beside my book on the New York Times bestseller list,
Right,
just so everybody knows,
right.
because a lot of those political books, and I don't want to get into politics at all, but a lot of those political books, there's an asterisk beside them because what they do, especially week one of the release of their book, is they're rich, they're super rich. So they just get a super PAC or some organization that they belong to buy 20,000 copies of the book, and it's cheating, and that's why you see, and they can tell this because there's bulk orders or the orders are coming off the same IP address. Or so when you see an asterisk beside a book on the New York Times bestseller list, what they're saying is yes, it was a bestseller, but it cheated.
Yeah,
It
right.
bulk bought books by some rich person or super PAC. So no, mine wasn't that. Mine, I think, was just the topic was unique, and it was something that nobody else had written about in that way. And I think I'd like to think I'm a good writer in the narrative style of how I write, and obviously some of my wit and humor is in my crack jokes and have some Easter eggs in there, and whether it's Guns N' Roses lyrics or Beatles, Star Wars stuff. So I think it was just a topic that people could relate to, and then it's also fascinating to think this tiny, tiny insect just transformed our planet from start to finish. It shaped our own DNA. I mean, it's remarkable the power that the mosquito in vectoring these lethal pathogens has had on humanity. And so I think the topic just hit home with a lot of people. And so it sold a lot of books. Uh, and I was thrilled and humbled, and it was an amazing experience.
Is the horse getting there,
The
or
horse
not?
was not a New York Times bestseller. So there's different bestseller lists.
Uh-huh.
There's three main ones: a New York Times bestseller, Los Angeles Times bestseller, and the American Book Association bestseller. Now the mosquito was all three. The horse was a national bestseller on the American Book Association list. So it was a national bestseller in Canada. It was a national bestseller in the U.S. as well. So yes and no.
Yeah.
It's done very well, and again, I love doing what I do. I don't do it for the accolades. I don't do it for bestseller lists or awards or any of that. I do it because I just love doing it, and I get to learn so much through my own research and writing. And in my personal view, life is a pursuit of knowledge to make yourself a better person through understanding of different peoples and different cultures. And I just love what I do. So, I
It,
wouldn't keep writing. I wouldn't keep writing them.
well, it shows that you love what you do, and to take two completely diverse topics, mosquito and horse, and do such a great job on both, that shows, that proves that.
Well,
So
thank you.
one last question that some of the people that are watching this don't want to know, but I really do. I know that you have eaten horse. What does it taste like?
Yeah, I've traveled all over the world, and I've eaten all sorts, dogs, cats, you name it, lizards, spiders, snakes, and horse as well. The book talks about why we in the Western world generally don't eat horse meat, although in Europe they eat a lot of horse meat. In French Canada, they eat a lot of horse meat. In fact, Canada is the biggest exporter of horse meat in the world. Um, it's its own unique taste. It's very lean, like extremely lean, as you can imagine, looking at the animal. With there's not a lot of fat on those animals, So it's very lean, and it has to be obviously cooked rare, like you would venison or elk or caribou or moose. Um, it doesn't taste like beef per se. I really can't explain. The closest thing I would compare it to would be caribou or elk, but even then, it's not that. It's its own unique kind of flavor, and it's more flavorful than beef for sure, or bison for that matter. But it was delicious, and I know that might be hard to digest for some of the viewers, but
No pun intended.
so. But again, you don't have to. You can choose whatever you want.
There you go.
I respect everybody's dietary preferences.
Very good. Thank you so much. I want to give you an invitation. We do riding ties all over the country, and you don't have to be an incredible horse person to do that. So look up, and particularly if you're coming east sometime, look up and get in touch with me. I would love for you to get to experience that. So kind of keep your eye open for that. Even though thinking about you and hockey, polo might be the better equestrian sport for you. That's a little closer maybe to your sport.
I'll warn you. I mean, I've ridden horses obviously numerous times, but I'm not an expert equestrian. Not whatsoever. I love horses and they're beautiful, and I enjoy more of a trot. That's kind of how I roll.
Well, I didn't ride until 14 years ago, and now they've totally changed my life. If I wrote my history, it'd be kind of like yours. My life is so different than it was 14 years ago when I started. So, yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope that a lot of our folks will go ahead and buy the book, because it is so well worth the read. I'm going to have to read it a couple more times to digest all of it, but it's well written, and I'm so thankful for you for doing that for us and for the horse community.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.